Hi everyone, Aaron here for Zollotech, and the iPhone 14 Pro has been out for just a couple weeks, and for the first week I reviewed the 14 Pro Max. The second week I started to review the 14 Pro. Now my wife has been using the 14 Pro for the past couple of weeks since the launch day, so we'll talk about her experience with it in just a moment. But let's first go over sort of the overall size and things that are different, and then we'll talk about the overall experience using it. Now, iPhone 14 Pro is slightly taller and thicker, but slightly narrower than the 13 Pro. So holding it here, you'll see that the overall camera bump is definitely larger, and cases will not fit from the 14 Pro to the 13 Pro and look proper, or the other way around. From the side, you can see that they're very similar. Not too much of a change there whatsoever, but the power sleep wake button is dropped down a little bit. Of course, we have that larger camera bump. From the top, there's no difference. And then the other side, of course, we have no SIM card. So no SIM card in the USA models this year, but they are around the world. But overall, they're very, very similar. And of course, we still have Lightning on the bottom. So we've got Lightning and then your microphone and speaker. Now, other than that, the overall weight is a little bit different as well. So we do have a slightly heavier phone this year at 7.27 ounces or 206 grams compared to 7.19 ounces or 204 grams. We have a 6.1-inch display, and again, they've made some slight changes due to it being slightly narrower. So 2,556 by 1,179 at 460 pixels per inch. So pretty much the same as far as the overall density, very similar as far as that goes. Now the display is super bright, I've mentioned that before, where it's 2000 nits in bright sunlight, 1600 nits for HDR content, making it the same as the Pro Display XDR, so that's great, and it has great viewing angles. It does have PWM technically, but I can't detect it. In fact, I can't even find it on 240 frames per second. You just don't really see it, so it's not something that should bother most people. Maybe they're employing DC dimming and maybe using some different techniques with the always-on display, but it doesn't bother my eyes even a little bit this year. I think this is the best display Apple's ever used as far as OLED goes, as far as PWM. Now we have ceramic shield on the front, of course stainless steel around the outside edge, and then ceramic shield and sapphire crystal for the lenses. All of this seems to hold up very well over time, even if you don't use a screen protector or a case. I haven't had too many issues there, unless you're banging it into maybe a diamond or some steel or something like that where you could eventually damage the display. If you're careful with your phone, though, it seems to hold up really well. Size-wise, too, I think this is the perfect size for most people. In my hands, it's a little bit small, but it is nice that I can use it one-handed. At least I can use this phone one-handed, just reach up to the control center, go into notifications, go into different apps. It's nice to be able to type this way. However, it is a little bit small for me. Given the size of my hands overall, the 14 Pro Max is more my size. So you'll see them in my hands side by side. There's definitely really the 14 Pro Max looking like it's a normal phone in my hands compared to most people. But I think the 14 Pro is probably the perfect size for most people, even if you're coming from an 11 Pro Max, as when you go to these squared off edges, it makes it feel a little bit bigger. And of course, you've got the larger camera bump. So I think this will be the perfect phone for most people, unless you really want that extra battery life. Now, of course, we have the dynamic island. Now, you can't see it here very well, but you can see it pretty well on my wife's phone. She's been using it like this with the yellow case, and she's got the silver 14 Pro. And I asked her what she thought of the dynamic island, as it's sort of a playful thing I've shown off in multiple videos, and she said it's something she doesn't even notice. In fact, she said she notices it less than using it with a notch with the previous phone. Prior to this, she was actually using a 12 Pro. So she skipped a year, went from a 12 Pro to a 14 Pro. And so didn't really notice the dynamic island at all. Says she never uses it. It's just something that stays out of the way in her opinion. So for some people, depending on your overall view, she's not really into tech that much, doesn't really care about it. It just is her camera, and it's there from time to time. So no issues there. Some people thought it would intrude more, and it definitely does in YouTube videos and things like that. Let me show you that. And so you can see my iOS 16.1 Beta 3 review. Of course, the overall footage cuts into the dynamic island. You can zoom around that, and you'll see it just within the footage itself. So that's something to consider if that's going to bother you. It doesn't bother me too much, but I may have to shrink videos a bit so they no longer interfere with that. I've been using 18:9 aspect ratio videos for quite some time now. I may have to go back to 16:9, and then you won't see it at all. So I've mentioned this a few times, and I've actually released a couple videos like that a few times. Also, one other thing worth mentioning is my wife actually said the speakers don't sound as good. Now, I didn't notice this, but she went from a 12 Pro to a 14 Pro, and she said they just don't sound as clear to her for some reason. I didn't find or detect any problems with her speakers, and I don't really have any with mine. If I hit play here, you can hear them. Let me turn it up. All the devices here. Along with this, Apple also released iPadOS 16 Beta 10 along with Mac. It sounds pretty good to me. I've got no issues with it whatsoever. However, if maybe you're upgrading, you may notice a slight difference. Hers sound the same as mine as far as that goes. Now, the always-on display is something you're either going to love and already appreciate, or maybe you need to get used to or don't like at all. The good thing is you can turn it off, and initially my wife did not like it, so I asked her opinion again since she's been using this regularly as well, and she said she now likes it in that it shows her the time. She doesn't have to look at her watch or anything else. It's just available nearby, and it's always just there. So that's something she really appreciated. It just goes into sort of a sleep mode. And if you're using sleep modes, the actual display goes dark when it's on a charger at night. So if you just put it on a charger, it will actually dim completely off, or you can change those settings as well. So I think the always on display is nice. I really haven't noticed it taking a ton of battery, but it is something that some people love, some people don't. They wish it was just more of a black and white background as opposed to showing everything. Now, as far as the battery goes, the battery is technically larger this year than last year's 13 Pro at 3,200 milliamp hours. So that's up from 3,095 milliamp hours. According to Apple, it will give you an extra hour of battery life when watching video. Same as the 14 Pro Max. However, in day-to-day use, I didn't really notice an increase over the 13 Pro. So I didn't notice that. My wife didn't notice that over the 12 Pro too much. Let me unlock it. And I actually had to plug the 14 Pro into the charger more often than I expected. If we go into battery life, we'll check this phone first. You'll see here as it loads the last 10 days. Yesterday, she used it for an hour and 42 minutes and then had 3 hours and 22 minutes of screen off time and used about 30% of her battery. Depending on the day, it's varied from 2 to 3 hours per day of usage, using less than 50%. So you definitely could still get 6 hours, maybe 7, depending on what you're doing, just using it for regular tasks. She uses the camera a lot and music. So those are the things she uses most. And with my use, though, managing social media, YouTube, all sorts of things, I actually was not getting great battery. And to be fair, this has been on the beta sometimes too. So let's go ahead and wait for it here. Over the last 5 days, here's the day I used it the most, and I had 4 hours and 56 minutes of screen on time, 5 hours and 45 minutes of screen off time, and had about 80% usage or 90% of my battery used. So I think I could get about 6 hours if I was lucky. Again, the day before, almost 4 hours. So screen on time is going to vary how you use it. I do need to customize some of my notifications as they keep lighting up the lock screen, causing some usage to sort of deplete more rapidly. Now, one of the big upgrades this year, especially if you're coming from an iPhone 12 or older, is the camera. Now, it's a 48 megapixel main sensor with an f1.78 aperture, and then the ultra-wide and telephoto are still 12 megapixel. Now, initially, you probably won't notice a difference just taking regular photos with this if you're in good sunlight. However, at night, that's actually what my wife noticed the biggest difference on. The skin tones were better, and just taking it in lower light, things seemed to be a little bit better than what she expected. So that's something that was a big bump up from an iPhone 12 Pro to a 14 Pro for her. 13 to 14 may or may not be, but when it comes to certain scenarios, you're going to see an improvement. We have the new photonic engine with action mode, so if you're running across a backyard, for example, it will really stabilize that footage. Within the camera, you have that setting. If we just go into video, you'll see that we actually have this option here where we can turn that on, and now we have action mode. And so that works really well and stabilizes the footage in 2.8K. Of course, we have cinematic mode, and Apple has bumped that up to 4K 30 this year. Before, we just had HD, and we also have 24 frames per second. So it does a pretty good job as well. Something I don't hear a whole lot of people talk about is the forward-facing camera because it has autofocus. I think this is the best camera now for taking video. You can see yourself in it, and if I flip it over here, hit the button, now we're recording from the forward-facing camera of the iPhone 14 Pro. We're in cinematic mode in 4K, and autofocus works great. So if I bring it up close or bring it far away, it stays in focus and seems to work really well. In fact, all of the videos that I've filmed since the iPhone 14 unboxing were filmed when I'm on camera with an iPhone. It's just that good. I just set it in front of me and hit the button now. Now, I'm not a huge fan necessarily of cinematic mode all the time, but video looks great. So let me know what you think of that in the comments below. Now, of course, with the 14 Pro and Pro Max, we have the new A16 Bionic with 6 gigabytes of RAM. There's definitely a difference when it comes to Geekbench and everything else, but in regular everyday use, yes, it feels a little bit smoother, but not a big jump compared to maybe some previous years. It's fairly minor. You'll see things load as you would expect, going between different apps, maybe loading music. It's loading off the internet, so it takes a moment over Wi-Fi. It just depends on what you're loading and what you're doing. But apps and games seem to open a little faster, according to my wife, if you're actually moving over from, say, a 12 Pro. But everything else felt very, very similar. If you're going into the camera, it's pretty instant. You're really not going to notice a huge difference unless you're coming from maybe an iPhone 8 or maybe an iPhone 7 or something that's older. Now, also, connectivity is something I wanted to talk about because it's quite good this time around. They've upgraded the modem. If an eSIM won't work for you, that's going to be a negative, as you may need to swap your SIM card traveling to different countries. So maybe you can get the phone in a different country and use it there without an eSIM. But either way, connectivity seems to be better this time around. Fewer dropped calls, fewer dropped internet connection issues when maybe you're playing music. Just overall, it seems to be much better. Wi-Fi is the same with Wi-Fi 6, but no 6E, but we do have Bluetooth 5.3. For some people, they've had issues with this. Personally, I've actually found it to be better, whether that's with AirPods 3, the new AirPods Pro, or anything else. They seem to work really well for me. So these are actually paired with my iPhone, not my wife's, but you'll see it just connects, and I've had few issues with it. I know some people have had more issues, but I mentioned this in my 14 Pro Max review, is walking up to my car. It uses the phone as a key on a Tesla, and it just unlocks more quickly than it did. Sometimes in the past, I'd have to go into it, unlock the car, and then it would work. This time around, it seems to be more consistent as far as it working well. Also, speeds seem to be a little bit better. So if we go into speed test, we'll hit go here. And of course, it depends on where you're at and how many bars you have. But I have 2 bars of signal, and I'm not going to get a ton of speed because I'm sort of out in the country a little ways. But you'll see I'm getting about 12 megabits per second, 13 megabits per second. If I was to go closer to the city, this would be in the hundreds. It just depends where you're at. But you'll see I got 13.9 and then less than 1 up with 5G. 5G seems to be good here, but Wi-Fi is what I'm usually on at home because it's not great compared to other areas. But pretty much anything I've used out in this area is fairly slow just because I'm a little ways out. So I usually am on Wi-Fi, but overall connectivity seems to be good. I've had very few issues with dropped calls or anything like that. It seems to be much better this time around. Now, of course, we do have that satellite connectivity for SOS as well. Unfortunately, we can't try that yet, but it does look like it's something that's coming with iOS 16.1. We also have emergency SOS with car crash detection. So if you're in an accident, in an unfortunate situation, go to emergency SOS. You'll see call after severe crash. You can turn this off, of course, but it's something that I would leave on. If you're in a car crash, iPhone can automatically call emergency services. So that's something that's really nice just to have there for peace of mind if you ever needed it. Now, some people have had some odd bugs with the launch of this phone, such as CarPlay not working properly as far as the volumes and things like that, or people not being able to hear you. So there's definitely some issues. They pushed the phone out fairly quickly in the regular time frame they do every year, but it does have some issues that can be resolved with software. So if you're considering one of these, and you can find one that's available now, as many seem to be pushed out to maybe November even, maybe you want to wait until then anyway, until they work out the bugs with hardware and software. Many people say don't buy the first version of these that come out, wait for them to update them a little bit. So you may want to do that if you want to avoid bugs with CarPlay and things like that. Mostly it seems to be pretty good, but I think they will improve battery and some other issues. I had no issues with it getting too hot or anything like that, unless you're doing something intensive, which is completely normal. And so if you're thinking of upgrading, definitely it's worth an upgrade. I don't know that it is worth an upgrade maybe from a 13 Pro, but definitely from a 12 Pro or older, I wouldn't hesitate as far as upgrading. If you want a full redesign, you don't like this design, usually Apple updates this every year or so. So that should be coming probably with the iPhone 15. Usually every 3 years they'll redesign it. So we could have a completely redesigned phone, different camera bump, maybe even different display in some way. But I think the dynamic island is here to stay. So hopefully that helped you decide if you wanted to pick one of these up, and if you had any other questions, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed already though, please subscribe, and if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. As always, thanks for watching. This is Aaron. I'll see you next time.